In this lecture, we will be discussing the short-term causes of the Chinese Civil War. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the warlord era. And this era started in 1916 with the death of Shi Kai, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. And after this, China was split into regions that were ruled by local warlords. There was no definitive national government. So looking at the different effects that this had on the political, economic, military, and social aspects of China. Politically, there was no national government, no negotiation with foreign powers, and this opened doors to conflict with Japan. Economically, there were no jobs created because of the focus that the warlords placed on the military. There was no national currency, and revenue control was controlled by foreign countries. Militarily, warlords focused on strengthening their region's military, and fighting could break out at any time due to political instability. And socially, civilians were unable to sustain themselves because there were no jobs that were being created, and civilians and their property were in constant danger because of military focus. So now looking at warlordism and regionalism, the mindset of the warlords was that their region took precedence over China as a whole, and military force was the answer to almost everything. And warlordism led to an increased focus on creativity and intellect in the 1920s and 1930s. This new focus was fueled by a nationalist pride and brought about the end of warlordism with the acceptance of Chiang of the GMD as the leader of China. So looking at how warlordism caused the Chinese Civil War. When the CCP and the GMD were first formed, they both had the same goal, which was to reunify China under a stable national government and bring about the end of the warlord era. The GMD leadership change from Sun Yat-sen to Chiang brought about Chiang's conviction that the CCP was looking to overthrow him. And because of his suspicions, he attacked the communists because of his distrust, and this brought about the start of the Chinese Civil War.
So now going into the Treaty of Versailles and the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement was an intellectual revolution and socio-political reform movement that occurred in China from 1917 to 1921. The purpose of this revolution was for China to restore their independence and greatness by ridding themselves of foreign domination. So overall, the movement was basically directed towards national independence, emancipation of the individual, and rebuilding society and culture. So at first, China joined the war on the Allied side in hopes of gaining back German land. However, once the Treaty of Versailles was violated and they gave Germany to Japan, China got angry and students gathered in Beijing in a movement to go against the government. So the ultimate effect of this was after the Western powers broke the Treaty of Versailles, the Chinese people began to realize that the only people they could truly rely on was themselves, energizing and radicalizing political movements in China. And in addition, another political effect that this had was establishment of the CCP. And a social impact that this event had was the spread of communism, and it eventually brought the people together as they all went to bond together and go up against the Allies as they had broken the Treaty of Versailles. So this event, which occurred relatively close to the start of the Chinese Civil War, helps to prove that the majority of the causes of the Chinese Civil War were short-term. And because of this movement, the Chinese people began to unite and resist government, and this political era of communism was spread. So now going into the Chinese Communist Party. This party was founded by Mao Zedong in 1921, and it eventually became to be the ruling party of China. It coexists with other legal parties in China that comprise of the United Front. The ideology behind the Chinese Communist Party is Marxism-Leninism, which seeks to establish socialist states and develop them further. This was a short-term event that can be proven to have a huge impact on the Chinese Civil War. The battling ideologies between the Chinese Communists and the Nationalists caused much of the fighting between the two within the Civil War, and each party wished to be superior over the other and ultimately have their ideology ruling in China. And due to these contrasting viewpoints, it was really difficult for the two to coexist as their ideology differed so much. The communists on one hand aimed to create an equal classes society and abolish foreign influence, while the nationalists based their ideology upon nationalism, socialism, and democracy, causing constant clashing between the members and ultimately causing the escalation of the Chinese Civil War.
Next, we have Mao Zedong, who was originally a Chinese statesman who took an interest in communism and pushed for it in China. He was one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, which was originally allied with the Kuomintang, which was the major political party at the time. Due to their differences, they were not able to stay allied and they eventually became enemies. He later became the leader of the CCP and went against Chiang Kai-shek's anti-communist views, and he was the leader of the KMT. This revolution against the political party at the time caused tensions to increase between the CCP and the KMT, which led to fighting and eventually the Chinese Civil War. Also, the Japanese attack on China led to the Chinese Civil War because of Mao, as the attack resulted in the CCP gaining more power as compared to the KMT. This allowed the Chinese Communist Party and Mao, who was in charge, to gain a larger following against the KMT. This again resulted in an increase in tensions and arguments between the CCP and the KMT and eventually led to the Chinese Civil War. The First United Front was an alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, in which both parties made an agreement to complete similar goals that they held, such as preventing warlords from being the leaders of China. Although they were working together, the CCP tended to be more authoritative, which resulted in rebellion from the KMT. The United Front was created in 1923 and ended in 1927, when the KMT attempted to take over the CCP from the inside, which resulted in the near destruction of the CCP. Chiang Kai-shek turned on the CCP after he was sure that there was no chance of warlords being in charge. This was the cause of the Chinese Civil War because it continued to intensify the tensions between the two parties and eventually led to war.
Sun Yat-sen was born in 1866 and died in 1925, and he was known because of his as a leader in the Nationalist Revolution of 1911, which transitioned the government from the Qing dynasty to the warlord period, as well as being the leader of the Nationalist Party. He was born as a peasant, but he was schooled in Hawaii and Hong Kong, so he developed a very democratic and very Americanized view of how politics should go. At school, Yat-sen was religiously Christian, while his brother, a businessman, opposed his Christianity. As time went on, he became involved in revolutionary parties and thought he could overthrow the collapsing Qing dynasty, which was falling apart due to the Manchu tribesmen who had invaded, as well as just total supernatural support due to the Opium Wars that happened in the 1800s. After failing to recruit any officials to help him, he established China's first revolutionary organization, the Revived China Society. He tried an unsuccessful uprising in 1895, and he went into hiding from the Qing dynasty. By 1903, his goals expanded to a more socialist view, wanting to destroy all Manchu influence in China, and he created the Chinese Revolutionary Army. By 1911, his army started an attack on the Qing dynasty and took over roughly half the government. Sun Yat-sen was given a temporary role of president, but he had to give up that role in order to compromise with the general of the Qing army named Yuan Shikai. This allowed a democratic parliament to be set up in China. Sun was put as a supporter and a follower of Yuan. But as time went on, disputes between the two started up, and Yuan destroyed the parliament in China and took over as a dictator and almost an emperor. After his death in 1914, the warlord period started, and right before his death, Sun was exiled from all of China. Sun tried to set up a replacement government state, but he quickly failed. He then went revolutionary, and when he couldn't get support from the U.S., he went to the Soviet Union around 1923 and opened a military academy to train fighters and supporters to reunify the government. One of his supporters was Chiang Kai-shek, who was chosen as the commander of the academy. This military helped to create the nationalists who later went and reunified all of China. In 1925, after falling very ill, Sun died, and his death caused a power struggle that led to the reunification of China and the Chinese Civil War.
The next topic is the KMT shift right and Chiang's failures. So, Kai-shek took over the position as party leader after the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925. He focused on trying to keep Yat-sen's democratic views the focus of the party, but when fascism began to rise in Europe, it led to a worldwide rethinking of political party leanings. And at this point in time, the CCP and GMD were already in the midst of a power struggle for China. Kai-shek began leaning more right, with an increased sense of nationalism being at the center of his ideals. This newfound nationalism eventually led to the White Terror in 1927, which will be talked about in more depth later on. This was an attempt at the GMD made to destroy the CCP by killing many of their officials and members, but this plan failed due to a lot of different things. After this failure, the GMD solidified its shift to the right with extreme nationalism, and there were skirmishes and struggles for control and power that led to the more official outbreak of the Chinese Civil War between the CCP and GMD in 1927. World War II also had a large impact on the relationship between the CCP and GMD. As World War II was progressing, it appeared that the nationalists had gained the upper hand, but were failing to establish any type of solid government. The CCP had retreated into more secluded parts of China, specifically rural China, and the result of the war caused Kai-shek's hopes of stamping the CCP out for good. This never happened. And so the surrender of Japan caused the CCP to gain more confidence and take bolder actions to try and regain control of China. And the CCP was able to gain more numbers and power after the war. And they got a lot of peasants on their side, so a lot of the poorest and most deprived areas of rural China, which saved the party from disappearing completely. And Kai-shek's failure to establish government and take root in China during World War II led to the downfall of the GMD's control. And as Kai-shek sensed the GMD slipping, he began to enforce more right-leaning ideas and try to gain control, but to no avail. So Chiang's failures along the way allowed the party to shift right as a means to try and compensate for everything that went wrong. But the party ended up shifting right anyway, and this led to the downfall of the party and the rise of the CCP.
Alright. So the Shanghai Massacre, also known as the April 12th tragedy, was an uprising of the CNP against the CCP who were occupied in the city. The CNP was partnered with various Shanghai gangs, such as the Green Gang, who were unhappy with how the city was being governed by its various warlords. And the CNP partnered with these gangs and had the ability to form a 1,000-man militia that was powerful enough to destroy the forces within the city. The communists following this event were purged, all of them either killed or fled, and after this point, the White Terror started. This event marks the beginning of, could mark the beginning of the Chinese Civil War because the CNP and CCP were now very much fragmented. Previously, there were some relations between the two parties, but now they're two completely different parties, two very different ideologies. And the CNP even broke between a left-wing and right-wing ideology party. So after this point, the major powers of China were very much fragmented. The White Terrors was the period of time directly after the Shanghai Massacres of 1927. So the White Terrors were basically the period of time in which the CNP, who had just taken over Shanghai, began to purge out the communists. After they had purged out the communists, they went to fear-mongering. They would threaten the elites, the urban elites within the cities, and force them to pay up large amounts of money in order to fund the armies. This White Terror, as it was called, spread to other cities that were under CNP control and caused large amounts of unrest within the nation. While this was going on, the CCP turned to rural areas to gain support and power, and after this point, both powers were primed for civil war.
Okay, so the Nanjing Uprising was an armed resistance led by the Chinese Communist Forces. It began on August 1st, 1927 in Nanjing, Jiangxi, and it intended to counter the anti-communist rebellion by the Nationalist Party of China. The uprising had a profound effect on the Chinese Civil War and its origins, despite happening fairly recently before it actually began. It lifted the curtain for the CCP to independently lead a new armed force, as prior to the uprising, the CCP had no troops of its own and was formed of a collaboration with the Kuomintang, which excluded this possibility. The nationalists were split into two factions. The right faction was led by Kai Shek, installed in Nanking, where a government had been set up on April 18, 1927, and a left faction remained in Wuhan, where it controlled the national government transferred from Canton. The CCP tended anyway to place more reliance on the proletariat of the towns rather than on their army, but nevertheless the forces of the Northern Expedition included a certain number of communist officers. Some of them held important commands, especially in the Second Front Army of the General Chang Fa Kuei, recently transferred to the Nanchang region north of the province of Jiangxi.
The Autumn Harvest Uprising was led by Mao Zedong on September 7, 1927, and it was a rebellion that took place in Hunan and Jiangxi. The army consisted of peasants in Hunan province, and Mao Zedong led them to fight against Kuomintang and the Hunan landlords. Eventually, the Kuomintang army forced Mao's army to retreat back into the Xinjiang mountains. This was one of the first armed uprisings that was seen by the communists, and it had an impact on the rural-based strategy that was incorporated in their guerrilla tactics that were seen during this time period. Following this, the Autumn Harvest Uprising and the impact it had on the guerrilla war strategies led to the Long March that took place from 1934 to 1935.
Moving on to the Northern Expedition. The Northern Expedition was a military campaign led by Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang for 2 years, stretching between 1926 and 1928. The main objective of the campaign was to unify China under its own control by putting an end to the rule of the Baiyang government. During the 2 years of fighting, several major battles were fought that shaped the course of Chinese history. The battles were fought between the Kuomintang and the Chinese warlords, and Chiang Kai-shek had prepared his men well for the expedition. The Shanghai Massacre occurred during this campaign, as Chiang Kai-shek decided to purge all communists from his ranks. After his decision to purge, the warlords staged a counteroffensive that slowed down the campaign, as the Shanghai Massacre allowed the warlords time to regain some strength. However, after the conflict, Chiang Kai-shek and his army were able to take control of China. The Northern Expedition led to the creation of a central government for China, however, did not completely put an end to the warlord problem. This is both social and military history, as Chiang Kai-shek only decided to fight the warlords because of the lack of unity the people of China saw. Prior to the expedition, the warlords of China controlled the country, and the peasants were forced to follow the laws and rules of the warlords. Chiang Kai-shek saw the lack of social unity and decided to use military action to solve it, and staged the Northern Expedition.
And here are the sources. That's it.